afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. The second one at Vitafoods, which I'm moderating. So thanks again to the organizers. So it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce the panel, and our session is the longevity equation. Don't need mathematics here for this equation, but we're going to talk through a range of different areas that are what you might consider longevity. We'll redefine longevity as well through this equation. So first of all, I'd like to introduce the panel. Maybe if I start with Raman.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Quick introduction.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. As introduced, my name is Raman. By background, I am a registered dietitian, so I've been working in the area of nutrition for a number of years and really believe in, I think, health span and longevity. I'm the co-founder of a company called BioAero, which is a biotechnology company out of Canada that focuses on a multi-omics approach to longevity and precision medicine, including whole genome sequencing, whole exome sequencing, metabolomics, proteomics, microbiomics, and focusing on how we can use that data to help us live longer but better.
Rafael.
Yeah, thank you for. My name is Rafael Decid. My background is genetic epidemiologist. I am working here in the IGTP Research Health Institute from Badalona. I'm leading here a population-based study using a national core in Catalonia, bringing the omic approach and exposome approach in order to define what is the background of the chronic diseases that affects the longevity around the population. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jerome.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Jerome Page. I'm a senior expert in musculoskeletal health at Nestle Research, and I'm adjunct professor at EPFL. So I'm a biologist by training. I've trained in muscle biology, and throughout my career, I've been interested to develop therapies from drugs to medical foods to foods and supplements that can help with prevention. So very passionate about bringing aging biology into people.
Thank you. And I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Director of Aging Research at King's College London and a visiting professor at the University of Oxford. I'm also Secretary General of the European Society of Preventive Medicine, so we're hosting this session as well. And I also have a nutrition and cardiovascular aging background. So maybe I can start the discussion by addressing prevention, since society is hosting, and what we consider prevention not only of age-related diseases, but prevention across the life course. So longevity is not when you reach a certain number, and aging isn't old age, it's from day one of life. And we need to consider prevention as appropriate to each stage of the life course, gender, and also the environment in which we live. And I know Rafael was interested in the exposome and everything that we are exposed to across the life course. So that's a central area of the prevention concept. And maybe start with Rafael. What is it that you're working on with the exposome and genetics? You mentioned that your program is actually looking at the genetics of the Catalan population.
Yes. Of course, I'm geneticist, I'm biologist, so the background is always molecular, so genetics is important, but we have seen that is not enough. So for most of the diseases that are involving the longevity, are chronic diseases that appear in the childhood, from the adulthood, we understand the genetic basis, but we need to understand what is the context. So the context matters, and we need to understand at a population level what are the vulnerability groups, understand what are the risks of different populations in different moments. And because we are approaching this problem of the diseases with a population perspective. So analyzing all the population with a lifespan perspective and defining the groups that are at risk, specific groups, for instance, socioeconomics or gender specificities that could be respond different to the genetics and the exposome. So doing this in the general population, we think that in Catalonia and linking to other populations in Europe, we can define better what is the impact of the diseases and genetics in longevity.
Thank you. Regarding the exposome, maybe it's a new term for some of you. It's everything we're exposed to, not only diet, but perhaps the air pollution, levels of sunshine, your sleep quality, and of course, the workplace, which we are exposed to for many decades of our life. And we need to collect data from each of these segments of the exposome to better understand what is the personal structure of our longevity equation. So is it personalized, or can we use population data? What do you think, Raman?
I think that it's a bit of both. I think we have to move towards personalization. And right now we're using population data, and sometimes that population data is too broad, and we need to bring that population data to more specific areas to focus on personalization, because one size doesn't fit all.
That's right. So when we consider personalization or even regional communities, we need to collect the data not only from the hospitals and the clinics, but at the consumer level. And Jerome is with Nestle, a well-known consumer goods company. How are you basing your research in human health, muscle health, and so on consumer data? Is it only marketing, or are you also looking at the biology behind your consumers?
Both, absolutely. And you need to find points of convergence, because obviously you need the differentiated biology to address novel and more efficacious approaches. And on the other hand, you need to be in a segment where consumers understand. And I think this comes back to the personalization discussion, where we see exactly the same thing. If you go in clinical trials, there's needs to stratify, there's needs to understand group, and the population, the individual level, is extremely important. Yet when we want to scale, well, there's a subset of consumers that want that personalization. It's actually very small worldwide. And to bring prevention at scale, we really believe the solutions also need some sort of simplicity, some identifying the common denominators, what we call these hallmarks, that can really bring that personalization angle and that prevention angle beyond just a few individuals, but really impacting that societal need at scale.
Maybe I can add another 2 P's to the equation. So we've talked about prevention, personalization, but also participatory. So this is the 4P approach, and the last P is precision. How can we take data from the gut, muscle, brain, heart, and multi-organs, and harness multi-omic technologies to better understand the data in the context of healthy aging, prevention, longevity? So Raman, you're working that space.
Absolutely. So we need to take the data. I mean, multi-omics provides us with so much good information that can help with that precision and personalization aspect. We look at things like the gut microbiome and understanding what different metabolites there are. You know, are there short chain fatty acids? Is there TMAO? What's elevated? What's decreased? And how do we then focus our individual lifestyle to our individual data points? We look at things like genomics or genetics, whole genome sequencing, bringing in things like nutrigenomics and pharmacogenomics. As a dietitian, you know, I can see 2 people that are the same, from the same family. I can provide them the exact same diet. Maybe they both want to do ketogenic. I can put them both on intermittent fasting and have them do the same physical activity, but the end result is different for each one of those. So it's taking those data points, understanding the omics and the multi-omic approach, and bringing it down to tangible pieces of information that we can use in our everyday lives.
Yeah, so that's really important to understand how genetics is really important. But some of you may have been to my colleague Tim Spector's talk earlier over lunch, and he works on twins, the twin studies at King's College London. Identical genetics, but very different exposome. And the outcomes are very different. So that's a good example of how we can't just base everything on genetics. But are you also considering, for example, epigenetics, the DNA methylation patterns based on the exposome, diet, lifestyle? How important is epigenetics?
Yes, epigenetics is the link between genetics and exosomes, so it's one of the links. So we have observed consistently in different studies that the exosome, the way that you eat, what you eat, and when you eat, affects the epigenetics. And the epigenetics also regulates the inflammatory state of the individual, the oxidative stress, so linking to different health outcomes that affects during the lifetime. So it's quite important to analyze this during the lifetime because it's changing the epigenetics. This is the point. You can
Sure.
modify.
And when we consider epigenetics, it impacts different organs in specific ways. So we're talking gut, muscle, and also brain. And brain health is an area that some of us are working on together in a European consortium, looking at healthy brain aging, how we might have biomarkers of cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, but more importantly, how can we prevent cognitive decline? What do we need to do at a much earlier age? So we're collecting exposome data, lifestyle data, and it really is important to understand the multi-omics, but also the multi-exposome. And what works here in Southern Europe is very different from where I come from in Northern Europe. So it has to be region-specific, context-specific. We were talking about this yesterday,
Yeah.
gender-specific across the life course. So, for example, a large organization like Nestle, are you looking at global markets? But what about specific aspects of each population group, each region group?
Yeah. So we always try to have a double approach to longevity. One is really meeting the nutritional needs, and these are absolutely humongously different between geographies. We were talking over coffee. If you take an Italian diet here compared to a UK diet, compared to even if you move to India, the basis of how we achieve our basic macro and micronutrient needs are extremely different, yet they converge on conserved biological pathways. So we're trying to do a bit of both to always have the nutritional requirements that fit with the needs of the population and find those nutrients that have that bioactivity against those hallmarks of aging that can be conserved to be able to scale, as I was describing before. But if I may, I think you made a very important point on precision. And here I see really the field being at a pivot point with the revolution of new tools that's happening. Today, these epigenetic marks are not only things you measure in labs. We have the algorithms that become available to make this quantitative in clinical trials. We're seeing out of the lab the work of Steve Orvert, who's pioneered this, and others, tools that bring the link between the resolution you need in clinical trials and being able to regress this against aging trajectories. So I think for the first time over the past few years, we have ways to quantify the rate of aging in people, and this is unprecedented. So I think collectively with the data you generate on the exposomes, on the real life evidence, this will give us that precision we need to make those interventions much more precise.
Yeah, I think precision nutrition is an area that we're just getting to better understand. And it's not only about supplements, but it's more about food as medicine. How can we have a precision diet? Not how many bottles you have on the shelf, but what is on your plate. And of course, that's very different whether, different regions, different cultures, and how we can take all of this data to make better informed decisions. And prevention is really important when we consider healthcare needs, healthcare economics. And I know we were talking earlier about how we can better inform policymakers, whether it's policymakers within large corporates or within the local government, because they need the information of what works in your population. To mitigate the increasing healthcare costs of an aging population demographic, and how we can best address this at the consumer level for prevention, not at the clinic level for treatment. So coming back to Raman, I know you come from a slightly across the pond. What do you think the local government, the Canadian government, are trying to do to address prevention? Because you have a very similar healthcare system to the UK.
You know, I think that more needs to be done. I think the default needs to change, and foods that are actually beneficial to brain health and longevity need to be accessible, and they need to be affordable, and they need to be available. I think that's a big role that the government can start to play, is looking at that accessibility point. It's easier to go to a fast food restaurant and pick up a burger and fries and a pop than it is to go to the grocery store and get something healthy. So I think from a population level, we need to focus on access, affordability, and availability.
So that's a really important point. It's affordability. What do we have access to? Prevention, healthy aging, longevity doesn't need to be expensive. Everything, one thinks, oh, it's only for the rich billionaires who can extend their life. But it is at the consumer level. It can be affordable. It can be actually cheaper to have a prevention lifestyle. And it's not a complex equation. But because we're all here in the Mediterranean region, you know, everyone's heard about the Mediterranean diet. And you've both worked on that kind of area. How do you think we can bring the regional diet? What is it about the Mediterranean region that might be helpful for prevention? Yesterday we were talking about blue zones.
Yeah.
So there's some blue zones in the Mediterranean region. But the concept that we proposed was that you can make your own home a blue zone from the prevention perspective. So what do you think about this region, the Mediterranean? Why do we promote the Mediterranean style diet?
I think that the Mediterranean diet has been demonstrated that is improving the cardiovascular health, diabetes, metabolic diseases. It's clear. But of course, I think it's here in this region because we have other contexts that affect this: the temperature, the daily working, the type of work, the working in the street. So I think that we cannot apply the same solution for all the population. So Mediterranean diet is good here, but maybe it's not in the Nordic countries. So to define policies, we need to take into account this and define the policies accordingly, I think.
Sure, maybe we should call it the Mediterranean exposome rather than the Mediterranean diet.
It has to be easy, though. Like one thing that I noticed coming from Canada, as you mentioned, that when I'm walking down the streets here, it's easy to grab a piece of fruit, or you're not bombarded with chocolate bars and pop cans and all these different ultra-processed foods. They're just not as common. Back in Canada or in the States, that's all you see. The other stuff is more rare. So I think it's easy to access it.
Sure. And it may be a little cheaper. You're saying that in Calgary, at least, you have to import much of
everything. Pretty much everything. It's needs to be imported.
But in this region, it's on your doorstep. But what about foods that we eat that are with a Mediterranean origin? So, Jerome, I think you mentioned that you've done some work in that space. So, although we don't live in the Mediterranean region, we can access olive oil, for example, and other Mediterranean foods. How has that been shown to prevent age-related diseases?
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for highlighting some of our recent interests. I'll zoom out a little bit because I think one of the fundamental realizations over the recent years is really there's what Laszlo Barabasi called the dark matter of food. There's a lot of non-nutritional molecules in food that actually crosstalk with the cellular and the metabolic pathways of our body. And I think part of the Mediterranean diet comes from this. Part comes from the healthy macronutrients that we should never forget, having the unsaturated fat, the omega-3, the fiber that's often kind of forgotten. There's a big focus on protein, probably too much, but the fiber and the crosstalk with the fat is equally important. But what I can stress is there's some of these non-caloric components of food that are in constant equilibrium into our cellular pathways. And I believe this is very difficult to deconvolute. So this is one of the challenge and the opportunities ahead with the evolution of the analytics and the evolution of the data science. And one example, for example, that we've came across was a polyphenol from olives that can actually crosstalk with mitochondria, so the powerhouses of our cells that really provide the cellular energy. And this we came through understanding the so-called molecular hallmarks of aging. We analyzed human muscle biopsies from different individuals that had different lifestyles. And we realized this one single pathway that regulates calcium homeostasis, which basically in muscle couples contraction to energy production, was regulated by some of these polyphenolic compounds. So this is a very molecular example that you can find food-derived molecules that act directly in our body, and we could run clinical studies providing back the molecule, understanding exactly where they bind on the molecular transporter of calcium in the mitochondria, but also showing they activate mitochondrial activity and prevent fatigue in people. So there's ways to deconvolute this at the molecular level. Of course, you can do it with one or two or three examples. I think the opportunity and the challenge ahead of us is to integrate all this together.
Sure, thank you, Jerome. Maybe we can stay on the muscle theme, because I know we've discussed with colleagues, not only optimum performance, that's what we think about muscle bodybuilding and so on for athletes or the younger generation, we're saying they spend longer in gyms and so on. But how about preventing muscle loss in aging populations? Frailty is going to become much more prevalent with the aging demographic. Yeah. What can we do decades in advance to maintain muscle mass? Is it only through exercise? Are there supplements? Are there foods? Is it moving to a blue zone? What can we learn from the studies about frailty and prevention?
So I think the first thing we learned is, you alluded to this, is exercise is today the most dominant factor. So if anything in the prevention equation, the lifestyle and the ability to move, the constant, the steps. And I think with the digital tools, what we've learned is like the WHO 10,000 steps that we all have in mind are actually a bit outdated. I think the latest research really shows any type of exercise makes a difference, and even the lower step count. So I think in that exposome data, I think the activity must be considered as one of the dominant factors, and not only as a theoretical message, but also with infrastructure. We were discussing this between geographies. You have a lot of structural differences that actually impact the ability to move. So, and from the nutrition side, of course, the protein intake is one of the key ones and late in life, proteins are absolutely key as the building the block to muscle to maintain those anabolic signals. In a healthy diet, in healthy individuals, of course, the protein intakes needs to be tailored to the lifestyle. What we see is actually a bit of an overhype over protein, to be very transparent, and the risk is overconsumption of protein leads to oxidation and to metabolic fuels that are not necessarily good for you. So scaling the protein intake to the activity is very important, and of course in muscle mass gain, if you have specific health goals, this is key. But we see the main need when you really in that geriatric transition at the old age, when you get protein malnutrition, and these are the moments where really the intake is super important, because you have to override the natural protein intake resistance that comes with age.
Yeah, that's really important. So Raman, one of the companies that you're associated with is Biosports. Now, we talked about sports not only being performance athletes, but how we might consider sports or physical activity in as the exposome in our daily lifestyle. What are you advising those who want to be more active from diet perspective, physical activity, all the way through to perhaps amateur sports?
The Biosport is I'm the CEO of a company called the Biosport, and the Biosport looks at your genetic data and using your genetic data, your DNA, to really understand what your risks are and what kind of exercise or workout routines you should be doing to maximize your individual athletic performance. So whether that be going to the gym to increase muscle mass or preventing sarcopenia or being an Olympic level athlete or a young athlete starting out, I think one of the biggest focuses on prevention should be tailoring any activity that we do to our own DNA. We want to maximize our muscle potential and our muscle mass throughout our lifetime. But if we don't know how to do that properly based on our individual needs, then we may be, working against nature. I can give my personal example. Being kind of in that perimenopausal age, I'm wanting to increase my muscle mass, started going to the gym, started, lifting weights and thinking, okay, this is the right way to do it. When I did my whole genome sequencing and looked at the various proponents, I learned that I'm more endurance-based. I don't like to run. I'm not a runner, but I'm more endurance-based versus strength-based. My muscle fibers are like that. So I switched to my gym routine, focused more on endurance, continued to do the weight, of course, brought in the nutrition component and started to see differences very quickly because now I was training to my DNA, to my personalization.
So coming back to your DNA.
Yep.
And also epigenetics, of course.
Yes, of
so
course.
I think that's really important, that the epigenetics,
of course,
the DNA methylation, the microRNAs and so on, do dictate, the outcomes of the lifestyle intervention, the diet, the exercise, the exposome. And I think that is an important part of the equation that we are not harnessing yet. We need more tools, precision tools, and also to make the tools cheaper so that we can get the data straight to our smartphone, that we can make immediate choices. So coming back to the gut and genetics, because we're talking about human genetics, but are we considering the microbiome? So there's more microbiome genetics and human genetics that are involved. How do we need to better integrate that kind of data, that information in our consumer choices? So maybe coming back to Rafa, I know you're looking at human genetics, but have you considered the microbiome in different regions, especially here in Catalonia?
It's pretty difficult to perform this in the population perspective because it's expensive, so you cannot personalize this in a global way. But there is some analysis that has been demonstrated that the microbiome is important to define this final outcome. So right now there is some diseases that maybe like colon cancer that is more related to the have more evidence, no? But they are personalizing this approach to perform these advices, no? But I think that in the general population, it could be difficult to analyze this. It's, as you say, it's very expensive, and from our analysis in other diseases, no, one of the of the factors that are more important in affecting disease is the socioeconomic status. So you have physical activity, the diet, everything, but over there is the socioeconomic status. So there is the capacity of the people to access to these recommendations and to apply. That is important. So before to apply the microbiome, they could be interested in clinical settings at the population level. I think that we need more evidences to apply in the general way.
No, thank you for that. Some of you may have been in this audience 2 years ago. My colleague James Kinross was talking about microbiome and colon cancer. He's a GI surgeon, but he's really interested in how we can harness what we know, which is still scratching the surface about the microbiome. And it's not only the gut microbiome. As we were discussing yesterday, it's the oral microbiome, dental health, really important determinant, skin microbiome, vaginal microbiome. They all are part of our exposome, what we're exposed to, the metabolites from the microbiome that we need to consider in addition to the food and the supplements as well. So I think that's part of the multi-omics that you're working on.
Absolutely it is. And you're right, it's not just about the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome is probably the easiest one to study because there's so much diversity and there's so much of a population there. But from a women's health perspective, as a woman's going through the various phases of her life, the vaginal microbiome opens a lot of information up in regards to her health and the exposome. as well as the skin microbiome and the oral microbiome. There's linkages from the oral microbiome to even cognitive health and dementia.
Sure.
Yeah, so
So that brings me to, in the last few minutes, about the brain. Because we are working on prevention of cognitive decline together. What is it that we need to consider? We've talked about digital biomarkers already. How can we better harness, our cell phone to address many of these issues? Are we tracking the exposome, not only our health, but the environment around us? How can we integrate that data that we're tracking, wearables, workplace environment, and so on, and link it with healthy brain aging? So we normally don't think about dementia, Alzheimer's disease, but we know about memory loss. We know about, we're jet lagged, or we've had a late night, well, which is late every night here in Southern Europe, but, that does impact our sleep quality and so on, and that has an immediate effect on our brain health. So we often try to prevent brain fog, and I know we've all experienced that. What are the interventions that might be through diet, lifestyle, exercise that can prevent brain fog, not only neurodegenerative conditions? So, Jerome.
I think it's a fascinating but difficult question because the diversity of cognitive phenotype is so large. And from the cognitive decline that happens very late in life to the continuum of what you feel on a daily basis, of course, there's science gaps. I think what I see as one of the bridging areas in the field is really these molecular clocks, because WHO has established these functional domains, and I think we need to find ways to link what happens acutely in every day. The digital technologies are one, but I think these molecular clocks, for example, WHO has defined these intrinsic capacity with functional domains, and a few months ago, molecular clocks were published against these. So today you can start to interrogate what happens in an individual between what you can record with sensors, with all the digital, the smartwatches and so on, to these molecular tools that integrate periods over days to weeks to months to your long-term trajectory. And I think this is the challenge. So of course, this fair is full of solutions to help with the acute and the stress, the anxiety. There's many, again, the microbiome there has a big crosstalk because some of the mechanisms of the neurotransmitters also crosstalk with digestion and
Sure.
signals from the gut. So I think we have plenty of ideas, but to bring them into a continuum, I think needs further research.
Sure. No, absolutely. That's why it's really important as an academic. We do interact with our industry partners, which are thousands here, but we do have a research program with Nestle, with BioAero, and so on, to really answer this equation. We have the equation, but do we have the answers? I think we need a lot more a robust science behind it, the clinical and also the consumer studies, so that we can give better advice to the policymakers and also to the consumers.